this feeling of standing out, the need to stand out, actually is deep down a feeling to not be enough. Once you understand that, everything changes, I think. Almost everyone is on some level shaped and driven by fear of not being enough, fear of not being seen, of not belonging. I think what we can change is how aware we are of it.
Our inner well-being is something we in society rarely talk about, but today we do. We're speaking with Jonas Muff today, founder of VARA, a top AI healthcare company. Jonas wrote a widely shared essay called The Curse of Being Driven, where he shares a deep mental reckoning. A collapse during a crucial fundraising moment forced him into a years-long investigation. What actually drives me? Is it purpose or fear? Is ambition a calling or just a defense mechanism? In the next 45 minutes, we unpack the curse of being driven, why founders confuse action with avoidance, and how Jonas rebuilt his ambition on a radically different foundation. This is one of the most honest conversations we've had on the show. If you want to enjoy more of our content and dive deeper into startup land, check out our twice-weekly newsletter at followthegradient.io. On Tuesdays, we share a rundown of all things entrepreneurship. On Thursdays, we share exclusives from our podcast guests. And now, enjoy. Jonas, in your essay, The Curse of Being Driven, you describe being in a Tel Aviv hotel room, unable to leave bed at a make or break moment, even though everything was on the line. When you look now back at that moment, what did that collapse teach you about where your drive actually came from?
Yeah, great question. Well, so I think important for context, and this is also how it played out in my mind back then. Up to this moment, almost everything in my life was always a steep upwards trajectory. Never really faced failure or rejection up to this point. And I think over the years, building the organization in Switzerland, then joining Merantix in Berlin as one of the first employees, then starting a health tech AI company, a deep tech company right from business school, basically. I really started to kind of develop this story in my mind of this guy that starts a company right away, and a deep tech company, at its core. And then, during this first bigger external fundraising round, it was just the first time I, faced all the pushback, all the rejections. I think it was by far more than 100 rejections from VCs back then, and therefore for the first time I really, faced that story I told myself all the time, the identity I had built in my mind, basically was severely at threat. And back then, this feeling of not being functional anymore, the feeling of not performing anymore, and not getting out of bed in the morning, and especially in the middle of a funding round. I think back then I saw it as probably my biggest failure ever, and I was even shameful about this, I would say, because as entrepreneurs we learn that we have to push through, and we have to be resilient, and we need to be bold even when others don't believe in us. And with this story in mind, and the self-worth that I took out of the story, basically, I saw this as a huge failure that was really an identity threat at its core. And I think back then I didn't see it that way, but now looking back, I think that was the start of a huge process, a start of a transformation, if you want to use those big words, because I think it was the first time I started to realize that maybe the story actually isn't real, right? Maybe it's just mind-made, basically, and made up. And I think now when I look back, I think the big journey over the last couple of years started there, and so I grew very convinced that in breakdown there's the chance for breakthrough. And I think in my case it was really that I could separate myself from this identity, that the story that I told myself all those years.
I already have 100 follow-up questions on your points there, but maybe for the very beginning, for the people who also haven't read your essay yet, The Curse of Being Driven, how would you describe how that curse feels like from the inside, really going day to day?
Yeah, I think when I speak to people that were in similar situations, it can be very different for others. But in my case, I think the best way to describe it, I think, is a feeling of paralysis. So basically, just a feeling that in my mind, in the head, I'm wide awake, and I'm spinning scenarios nonstop. The overthinking never really stops. and I'm even during nights wide awake, but the body simply isn't, right? The body is so exhausted that it's very difficult to move and get out of bed in the morning. There were times when, like in Tel Aviv, for example, the question we just discussed, right? That I couldn't get out of bed until 10, 11 a.m. in the middle of a funding round, right? So the middle when it actually matters, couldn't get out of bed. But in my mind, it's not that I was sleeping, right? In my mind, I was awake. Just the body wasn't. And I think now in retrospect that can be very well explained because, as I said before, this story was at threat all the time. I felt I need to defend myself from danger all the time, basically. And it's well known that when we face danger, when an organism faces danger, there's either a fight or a flight response. And I think in my case, there was just a flight or a freeze response, better said, right? That the body basically shut down. It wasn't able to perform anymore the way I was used to. So that is, I think, a good way to describe, at least in my case, what happened in my case. I think the other thing that really stands out and also shocked me at times was that in those moments, especially back then, of course, when it was all very, very fresh, I always had the feeling that everyone basically is against me, right? So everyone and everything somehow happens against me. So I had this like hyper focus on myself all the time, and that everyone wants to do something against me, basically, and I need to constantly defend myself against the world and against everything that happens to me. And I think this almost paranoia feeling, basically, I think is a second thing that if it happens in a more subtle way today, it's always an early sign, and because it's a really terrible feeling that you have to feeling you're alone against everything happening to you. So I think those are the two things I think that describe that feeling really well. The feeling to not be able to move anymore, the paralysis, and the paranoia that everyone and everything conspires against you.
I think that's a really good breakdown of what it can feel like. And you later wrote that the engine wasn't purpose but fear. And you talked about this paranoia and this inability to move. So when did you realize that distinction, purpose versus fear, and how did that now change the way you build VARA?
Yeah, well, I would say it's took a surprisingly long time, I think, and that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to write and why I published this essay in a very open and candid way, because maybe it can shorten the time it takes for others. I think in my case, what after this breakdown, whatever you want to call it, that during that first funding round where I really felt I need to change something, otherwise I cannot continue with this journey and I cannot continue being an entrepreneur if I don't get to the bottom of things. Then I started therapy, for example, and many other things, and I learned very early, actually very quickly, that it's very important to me for some reason to be special, to stand out. Right, there was something I recognized quite early, and that the drive to stand out and to be special is my almost my operating system, basically, that keeps me going all the time. What I didn't realize until quite some time later, a couple of years later, actually, was that this feeling of standing out, the need to stand out, actually is deep down a feeling to not be enough. In a way, it's like trying to be special because deep within, I simply didn't feel special. Right? I think that's often described as vulnerable narcissism out there, for example, or grandiosity in psychology language. And I think that really describes well what I mean with the curse of being driven and me being driven by fear ultimately, and not purpose, at least not only. And I think that I realized only quite late, and I think that is the one of the key messages that I hope others can learn about much earlier, because once you understand that, everything changes. I think now to your question, how this changes the way I act as an entrepreneur, and how I built my company VARA. I think one thing that is maybe a bit sad news, but I think the fear will always be there. I think it's so deeply ingrained in us ones, those that feel the same way as me. But I think even generally you can say that almost everyone is on some level shaped and driven by fear. fear of not being enough, fear of not being seen, of not belonging. And I think that fear is part of us. I think what we can change is how aware we are of it. And I think there's a continuum between being fully aware and see the emotion, the fear coming up in everyday situations, especially under pressure. On the other side of the continuum is like being completely oblivious to it, and be constantly, let's say, run by it on autopilot. And I think what you can change is to basically be more aware in more situations more often. And I think that is what I'm trying to live as an entrepreneur, and what makes me much more intentional and sharper and clearer as a leader as well of the company I'm building.
Mm-hmm. And you you bring up a point where I have seen various VCs also that actively say that they are supporting like founders, and the best ones are the ones with traumas and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So there is something about it, and I think like many listeners and just like founders out there can connect to what you're saying. So you're not the only one out there having that drive, which also has a good and bad side. I had another talk with a founder who said like basically my strength is also my weakness, and I think it
Mm-hmm.
goes also into that direction. And you also connect this entrepreneurial obsession with performance. In neuroscience, they call it this default mode network hyperactivity. So the brain self story on loop, which you also described, can also go into like a negative loop. So you said you will want to talk about it in order to also help others, but how can founders or also operators recognize when that mechanism is running them and it's really not for the benefit, but really for the curse, so to say?
Yeah, maybe let me first comment on what you said before.
Mm-hmm.
That to a certain extent, VCs, for example, they even search for people that have something to prove, right? Because they'll be able to see the future where others don't yet, and they will be able to push through challenging times when others give up, because they have something to prove, and so they'll stick to it. And I think in a way you can even argue that for some of the biggest problems to be solved in the world, often through technology, through deep tech, through breakthroughs, some people may simply have to suffer, right? In a certain way. It's a bit of a provocative statement, but I think there's some truth to it. So yeah, I fully agree that the strength is often also the biggest weakness, and in suffering there can also be the path to building stuff of tremendous value. Now, to your question, how this default mode network hyperactivity shows itself, let's say, in a way that I think most entrepreneurs, even those that haven't confronted themselves a lot about it, I think the easiest thing to explain it, and what I think a lot of people could relate with, is overthinking. I think that's something I've seen in so many founders and high performance operators in the startup world, that we know that we sometimes have to plan for the future. We have to make strategies. We have to think in scenarios. We need to present scenarios to our board, to our employees. We need to plan for the future. That's totally healthy and it's part of the job. But there's always a time where we cannot foresee the future, right? There's always uncertainty, and in a way that's part of the very game, right? Because every VC-backed company needs to have the potential to return the funds. So by definition, every VC-backed company has to pursue a vision that very well can also go wrong. And so there's always uncertainty, and we need to take big decisions, big bets under crazy uncertainty. And I think what I've seen in myself a lot, and also in many others, is that we sometimes try to not accept this uncertainty on a deep emotional level. It's just very dangerous, very threatful to the story that we tell ourselves. And so we find ourselves in yet another conversation with our co-founders, yet another long strategy document with yet another pro and contra list for certain decisions, and at some point that becomes very obsessive and definitely not healthy anymore. I think even in that behavior, there's even a lot of the suffering, actually, right? Sometimes it's super crazy, but sometimes we are more afraid of failure than what failure actually feels like when it happens.
Mm-hmm.
So the uncertainty is what really seems to create the suffering. And I think this endless overthinking loops, I think that's the default mode network. And therefore I think that's where you can spot that's that self story on loop, how you called it.
I'm wondering if that, because I agree to everything you say and also to the different observations, and I'm sometimes wondering if also another quite simple reason for that is age. I mean, so many people in startup land are like, let's say a maximum of 35 or something around that, right? But then if you look at statistics, and don't quote me on that, but I've heard these statistics that like the top 1% high growth startups are usually founded by people with 45 and above, right? And you like, they don't navigate LinkedIn, so you don't see them. But the statistics are pretty clear on that. And obviously you have more experience in your career when you are older, right? And people always say there is a lot of downsides to it, maybe, but there is certainly the upside that you have been through certain situations and been through the overthinking.
Yes, I fully agree. Of course, as you say, there's downsides, right, to starting companies in progressed age. You have more to lose, and etc. But yeah, I think everything you said fully resonates. I think ultimately we need to somehow figure out that the story that we tell ourselves, and the often we can probably call that ego, even though it's a very overused term, but the ego is often holding us back, and it makes us worse in decision making. Our judgment will be worse because sometimes we take decisions for the sake of maintaining our self story. We treat employees maybe worse than we should, or better than we should, depending on the situation. And I think it's very often fear of disappointing expectations, fear of disappointing ourselves, the fear of not living up to the ideals of what founders supposedly should be like. And I think with progressed age, we hopefully, I mean, I'm still quite young, but I can, definitely compare myself to a couple of years ago, right? And I think you just take yourselves and your mind a bit less seriously over time. And I think that makes us better entrepreneurs. I think that may be one of the probably many things going on why the statistic, is how it is.
Very much. And in our prep session, you pointed me also to the work of neuroscientists like, for example, Manish Giran, who studies how psychedelics and meditation quiet the brain's default mode network. So basically the network in the brain that drives this rumination and the inner narrator. From your own experience with meditation or altered states, what have you learned about then calming that inner noise without losing the ambition? Because you're still running your startup, and I hear you that you don't want to stop that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think I would even go one step further, that I not only that I don't want to stop, but I want to do it more and take potentially also even bigger risks and bigger bets.
Yeah.
Because now my relationship with my own drive is that it will lead to emotions, yes. And before I was always avoiding those emotions, and emotions were seen as a danger, as a threat, and that led to all the experiences we already talked about in the beginning of the conversation. And now I think I see emotions more as a chance to live a very fulfilling and deep life, even though negative emotions, of course, on a societal level, we always try to prevent them and avoid them. But I think also in negative emotions, there's the path to just a more fulfilled being, basically. And so I think being an entrepreneur, taking big decisions, having difficult conversations, really go all in, basically, I think is a strong path to living according to this life philosophy. And I think when it comes to meditation and all that, let's say, inner work of becoming more aware, more mindful, I find it often a bit of a tragedy that meditation still has this, I would say, stigmatized reputation. I speak to a lot of entrepreneurs, and almost everyone says, I tried a meditation already, because they have read it somewhere or they've heard about it in a podcast, and then they stop again after a few times trying, because it doesn't help for them, basically, or doesn't do the job. And I think very often people stop because they expect that meditation quiets their mind, quiets the thoughts, maybe even having no thoughts at all. And I think that's just very, very big misconception. I think meditation is not about not having thoughts. It's about becoming aware of how many thoughts we actually have. I think it's in a way almost the opposite. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the thoughts they're happening, but we're not really conscious about them. They happen all the time, and we go through life constantly thinking with ourselves, and we are very little aware of how often we actually think, and also the patterns, and how some of those patterns simply are so harmful to us. They and also made up, right? A lot of the fears, how they silently run us, but they don't actually make much sense. And so I think meditation is all about first even seeing how much is going on, and then secondly also realize that some of the thoughts I had yesterday, they, even if I want to reproduce them today, they're simply not there anymore, right? It's how fleeting everything is, and how quickly everything changes in our minds. And through this, I think we learn to just not take ourselves so seriously anymore, right? It's I think a lot about hearing the thoughts, but not listening to them in that sense. And I think that's what meditation actually is about. And now I think that's back to the my statement that I want to build companies even more than before. It's in hard situations, in hard moments, and in emotionally charged moments that the thoughts get super loud, and they are easiest to see, basically. And then basically not taking the thoughts seriously anymore is a very powerful state of mind. And so building companies gives me the practice to, or the opportunity to practice this on an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm. And like, I mean, meditation is one thing. What are simple evidence-based ways founders can begin to rewire those stress loops, not just theoretically, but really in everyday decisions and routines? I also think it's not just done with 3 times trying and then giving up, but really maybe also something especially for people who, like you also described, overthink and think their way out of suffering, or to try at least. What are things that, like, action-based stuff that you can recommend?
I think, unfortunately, and you probably expected this answer, there's little things that are simple, right? Because in a way, it's like one of the biggest frontiers that we have. And I think simple, quick fixes are very rare. But at the same time, it's a very non-actionable answer to just point at years of work and therapy and all that, because it's all not very accessible. And often, especially founders and operators in startups that by definition have very little time, they face themselves in a difficult situation, and they need at least the starting point. So I think of course, I mean, I don't need to mention meditation. It's obviously my number one recommendation, but maybe a bit easier is journaling. And journaling not in a sense of like, writing down pages every day, but more like taking note of situations that were really, really challenging. For example, taking note of, things that we were really scared of, things that we thought were the end of the world, like really, scenarios like, for example, a key employee leaving, being afraid of like the one-on-one because that key employee may voice his or her unsatisfaction and, maybe makes statements that he or she would leave very soon. And then basically write such things down. And then a couple of weeks later, you realize, well, actually 90% of what I wrote down never happened. And I think through that, you start to realize, well, something is going on here, and I seem to always the overthinking doesn't seem to serve me well. So I think that is maybe one thing. Other than that, I think very simple. I like to just take a bit of space in my calendar before key meetings. Doesn't need to be always, and yet I think 2-3 minutes is enough, right? To become more intentional before a meeting, and take a couple deeper breaths, or just put the phone away as well. Don't look at the laptop. Maybe just walk around in the meeting room. That does miracles in my experience, because you kind of you enter the call in a calmer way, and you'll digest the call or the meeting afterwards if you do the same again. So that is maybe a good thing as well. Other than that, I think what really helped me is also write down commitments to myself, basically how I want to live my life. I think generally have a certain life philosophy, maybe. I think maybe a bit of a big word, but a couple commitments that you want to live up to, and regularly look at them, and realize also how often you're actually distracted from what's really, really important to you. So things like that, maybe. Other than that, of course, the bigger things like meditation, psychedelics as a pathway to do the work. There's of course also therapy. That is obviously way too stigmatized still. But those are all the harder things, not the simple, accessible things.
And on that, just on that note about like reflecting and commitment and journaling, like we had a session end of last year about also the annual review template that I do now since a couple of years, and I can just like highly recommend it because it asks you all the questions, like what do you want to do in your life, what is important to you, be it in business, in life, personal, like, and it's really a nice way of reflecting on that if you want to have some guidance. But it's just,
Yeah,
we
that's
will add
great.
it to the show notes.
Yeah, that's great. Because also I think maybe what I learned as well is how important it is to think really long term, right? Think in decades, not months, and maybe not even years, but really like long term. Because on a long term, very long term horizon, you start to separate input from output a bit more. You realize that some of the input I put in today may not lead to outcomes yet, but they will in the future if I stick to it. So I think your annual reflection framework is also allowing us to think in long enough horizons. And the second thing is to kind of think in intentions, right? I call it commitments or intentions rather than expectations, because expectations, they always have an outcome in there, right? And very often we can just not influence what happens to us. There's always things we cannot influence, and it's suffering often comes from trying to control stuff that is simply not controllable. But if we set commitments and intentions rather than goals and expectations, then we focus on what we can control. And that's also like how we rewire our how our mind works slowly, right? If we focus on setting intentions and commitments rather than the outcome already kind of tied into it, which we can never control. So that's maybe an addition to the framework you just mentioned.
You wrote another article, a couple of others, but one of them is called "Why People Notoriously Compare Themselves," and you write that the need to stand out collides with the need to belong. How have you personally escaped that loop?
What you refer to here is certainly one of the most vulnerable things that I put out there already, because I mean what I ultimately experienced, and in a way is also something I still have to kind of figure out with myself, right? Is that sometimes there, even for friends, entrepreneur friends, basically, I deep within I somehow hope that they're not better than me, right? Because I my self-worth was so dependent on standing out. But then at the same time, they're friends, and I also want to be a good friend and also belong, as you said in your question. And as you say, those two things collide, and I think that's what I learned in many instances, that very often actually emotions collide with each other. We're very complex human beings, and when values or feelings collide, that creates even more of that overthinking loop that we talked about before. So I think that was the first very important learning, that competition between different values and or fears, maybe in that case. And the second thing is actually that upon closer inspection, you realize that behind both of those things is actually the same thing again, right? Which is again the fear, right? Like fear of not belonging and fear of not standing out in a certain way are the same. They're the same root cause, which is the struggle for love and attention ultimately, right? And so I think even understanding this and not running away by looking at some fancy frameworks or telling us yet another story again, like a founder that raced around that I didn't, and so then our minds start to find reasons for that, right? For example, that B2B SaaS scales faster than deep tech healthcare AI, or maybe it's just very difficult to raise in healthcare nowadays, and much easier in other verticals. But those are all just feeding that self story, the ego again, right? They're all excuses. And I think understanding that, well, actually, I feel that way because I'm afraid. It sounds very simple, but my experience is really that even only understanding that is already the path out. Because then you start to read as well that fear actually, is it really that bad, right? And when you practice this through meditation and through other tools, to kind of accept that fear, then it will go away automatically. And so that is, I think, the path through getting out of those infinite loops, as you say, right? Of wanting to be special, but at the same time not wanting to be too special to be always alone, right? So it's like this weird conflict can be resolved by looking at the root cause, which is we're afraid of, and that's okay. as long as we're aware of it.
Well, what's one very practical way for people or founders in that case to separate input from outcome? So, right, so that I do have a high ambition, but my anxiety doesn't necessarily go up as well.
Yeah, I think we already a couple of things that I said before. Maybe we can quickly revisit to think in commitments and intentions, not expectations, what we discussed before. And the long-term thinking, I think those are very important, because we often look at the outcome too short-term and underestimate how far the input we put in on a daily basis can actually bring us. And similarly, and I think that's something I found very powerful for me, is to think not in decisions in a way, but in taking bets. Right? Taking bets is different from taking decisions because it's more honest. There's stuff happening that we simply cannot control, and in a way, luck or fortune that can go your way or not will influence the outcome. And you can take the best decision quality. You can look at everything 100 times. You can discuss with 100 other entrepreneurs and learn from their experience, but you never really know what will happen in the future. And so even the best decision quality, no matter how much work you put into it, can go wrong. And so I think thinking in bets is more intellectually honest, because it is already factoring in that you need some luck as well. And I think those are just like some practical, let's say, reframes that really helped me. Intentions, not expectations. Thinking in bets, not decisions. And also especially thinking very long term, and don't get too confused about what's happening in the short term, but really trust that things will go the way they should, and when you think in decades.
You also, when it comes to practical like also concepts or like ways, you've also introduced this idea of lucid living, so kind of a different relationship to ambition and emotional intensity. With that in mind, what concrete things have you changed in how you lead since adopting this lucid living? And maybe also, like, when you look back at just the last year, like what did you maybe do differently because you were in the state, and what would the driven version without the state have done instead?
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, maybe I start with the example and then explain a bit more about it, perhaps. And what I'd like to say, I think being driven is not necessarily a bad thing. I think the problem is when we're obsessively driven, and especially if you're driven, if you're basically driving away from fears that we're not yet ready to confront. I think that's when it becomes a problem. And to give a very practical example, without going into examples that are probably better to keep confidential. I think all of us as leaders, right, we know the situation that there's an employee and you have a role development conversation, career development. And I had a situation like that earlier this year with an employee of mine, very talented, amazing potential, super important also for the company, not to say mission critical. And it was clear that that employee expected a promotion. And looking at like the overall situation of the company in terms of like the salary structure and the way we've built the team, I didn't consider this to be the right thing to do at this very point. And I think historically, I would have been, let's say, afraid is probably a bit of a big word, but I would have had a lot of respect for basically knowingly disappoint someone, especially if that someone is so important for the company. And then basically, let's say, find some way, right? We all know that, figuring out a way to still give maybe a raise, but not a title, or the other way around, and like all those kind of tricks and stories and compromises. We always find some ways, right? And I think that is not for the first time, but like one of the very prominent examples where I did this very differently consciously. I was like, okay, the answer is simply no. Let me sit down with you and explain that that's the best I can do right now. And then really, take the time to explain and give the appreciation by not by saying to the person what the person wants to hear, but by being candid and give a perspective, but a perspective I can stand behind, and very honest, very direct, clear message. And I think that is I think a good example, right? I still felt this like respect of what if that person leaves and blah blah. But it's like, yeah, well, there's stuff I cannot influence. If the person wants to leave because of that, well, then maybe the person is not the right fit in the long run. So better now than in 2 years, right? So I think it's a good example of like small example, but a good one to show how I think a lucid approach to such challenging situations as an entrepreneur may look like. And I think that's also my general answer to your question, what lucid living / lucid leading can look like. I think it's just I try to approach difficult conversations much more directly, be it with, investors, with employees, with my co-founder, rather than waiting or finding ways to contextualize a conversation, just go directly in it, have a difficult conversation, embrace the emotions that come with that. Also, I think I really started to live a philosophy I call vulnerability-based leadership, which means basically to also be very open, when I don't know stuff, when I have weaknesses, when I did mistakes, when I'm afraid of something, then I just tell people, even in all hands meetings and stuff like that, so that people see that that's totally okay. And that will lead to a culture of embracing vulnerability, and that makes us better because we reduce the ego at work, right? We create a culture where we're not shying away from not being perfect, which doesn't lower the ambition and the accountability at all. Actually, quite the opposite. We don't hide stuff from each other, and that creates trust and accountability. Actually, in a paradoxic way. And also I think maybe your last comment or last thought. I was reflecting about this recently. Nowadays, I'm much better at accepting when people are unhappy at work in the company. Like when there's when people are upset with each other, and they're upset with me, and they're upset with the culture, whatever. Of course, to a certain extent, you need to listen to that and do something about it, right? But I think if people are upset, or if there's, let's say, conflict at work, it can also be a sign that people care, right? And that conflict will lead if people are not ego driven, as I said before, and if they're working on their characters in a culture that allows them to do so, then conflict and being upset with stuff will make them find solutions, and it will make the company much better. And I think, my employees will need to keep me honest, but I think those are some of the examples of what I think very concisely what we do differently, or what I do differently, maybe.
If a founder in year 1 or 2 of their startup came to you in the grip of a burnout, what would be the first conversation you'd have with them?
Yeah, I think the problem with that is that I think burnout is a very challenging term. So I think I would avoid that term, not because I'm not because I'm one of those guys that disregards burnout, not at all. But I think burnout is a very imprecise term. So I think I'll try to avoid the terminology, and I think my focus will be on bringing across the message that it's very likely not the workload and the effort and the stress and the meetings that are causing the problem. So the solution will not be slowing down and doing less, at least not only. But I would try to bring across the message that it has very likely something to do with the story that person tells himself or herself, and the fears that story tries to overshadow. And that is very likely. That's the frustrating part. It's very likely not gonna work in the first conversation. But I will try to kind of tell my story and hope that the person builds some sort of a relatability to me, and then maybe the message sticks sooner than it did for me.
You said in another conversation that you once told your therapist, my expectation to you is that you help me raise my next big round.
Yeah.
And you also said that mindset is extremely common among founders. So that you don't necessarily differentiate between what you do in terms of work on your inner self and what you need to do outside in a specific role and execute in a specific role. So how do you what would be your advice for people to differentiate that?
That's a very difficult question. It's difficult because we need to care about our performance, right? It's like there's so much we can learn that simply will increase our performance, and performance is the goal of learning it, right? For example, how we how we hold one-on-one meetings, how we sell. There's countless of examples where it's great to go out there and learn and do that for the purpose of improving performance. I think when it comes to inner work, the ironic thing is that if performance is the goal, it will very likely not lead anywhere. If performance is not the goal and you do it for healing or for your own fulfillment and peace of mind, then it will automatically lead to performance in a way, right? So it's a bit like, if it's not the goal, you will achieve it. So basically, and I think what my conviction is that, you know, the ego and the story that we tell ourselves comes with limiting beliefs, and they hold us and the companies back. And so I think if we do the inner work and find ways to disidentify with that story that we told ourselves and understand how much of that was avoiding stuff rather than doing stuff for real purpose, then I think we remove distractions, we remove those limiting beliefs, and what's left, basically, if we remove a lot of the stuff, a lot of the bullshit we tell ourselves all the day, I think then we perform better. So I'm not sure if that is a satisfactory answer, but I think that in a way, inner work for performance cannot be differentiated from inner work for healing, because one leads to another, I think.
Before we now come to the rapid fire questions, I really want to like cover one last topic, and you already mentioned it before, but it's like the topic of psychedelics, because in our prep conversation, you also shared an interview with Michael Pollan, the best-selling author who brought modern psychedelic science into mainstream awareness. And Pollan describes psychedelics as reverse trauma, and one profound experience that can basically reset mental patterns. You also mentioned, for example, Gabor Mate, the physician known for linking trauma, emotional patterns, and performance. And we all link this in our show notes and the newsletter that we have with that session. I want to know from you, like, how did these ideas and also the possibility of psychedelics also shape your own understanding for your own sake and inner work, and really also because I feel like on a personal level that psychedelics is something that has been discussed a lot also in the States, in the entrepreneurial like communities, but it is still like a very sometimes negative related topic, where people only know the negatives, and it's just like a little bit so question marks. So I really want to learn from you, like how you perceive that and how it has helped you personally.
Yeah, that's a topic that is very important to me, for many things you've already said. That was a great introduction to the topic. Yeah, for me, it was super important in my journey. I'll try to keep it short, but basically, I did, psychedelics assisted therapy. So basically, in a way, a very well curated, well organized therapeutic approach to taking psychedelics in a retreat setting. And what it did to me was, I kind of relived the emotions and the experience of my early childhood, of my birth, and then basically it was surreal in a way, and probably it'll sound very crazy, but basically I kind of relived the struggle from being born very early, then getting all the attention from my mother, then basically my sister being born, her going through life much more lightly, whereas I was struggling a lot as a child, and then basically emancipating myself from my mother while also kind of being in this like perceived competition with my sister, and like trying to stand out and be special in order to kind of win back the attention that I got through surviving that like very early birth and like, a long time in the incubator as a newborn. So I kind of relived that journey, and I think what you said before, how Michael Pollan refers to it, I think it's almost like reliving the traumatic experiences that basically unlocks then how it felt like, right? Before, we can always talk about this on a cognitive level. We can understand that childhood has an influence, and we can understand that what our parents experienced also have an imprint on us, and all that is all cognitively understandable. But it's very, very different when you re-feel the emotions, and I think that is the impact of that cannot be understated, because you go out back into the world and into therapy and into meditation and everything you do, and you've unlocked something, and therefore I'm very convinced that psychedelics is one of the, if not the biggest lever that we have to fight mental health problems in the world. So super important topic to me. And on your question, I think, I also think it's different in the US to here in terms of like how the topic is perceived. I think one caveat, however, is in the US, I think a lot of people use it for microdosing purposes, which I think is very different to what I described. But then also there's a whole industry around psychedelics already. Ketamine is already legal. And I think that legal status of at least one psychedelic has changed the public perception. And I think maybe culturally, and I don't want to make this a cultural critique. We have enough of that out there right now. But I think in Germany and in Europe, we have this a bit more of this judgmental culture, right? It's like we judge others, and we don't realize how much we hold ourselves back by doing this. And I think psychedelics is super powerful, and it's not for everyone. Nevertheless, right? It needs to be done very responsibly, and I wouldn't use this as like medical advice or anything like that. But my experience was super good, and I think what I've learned about the neuroscience of mental health issues, all the basics there, and then also the science behind psychedelics, I grew very convinced that it will be an important frontier for the society to solve the mental health crisis that we have today.
Thanks for sharing.
We move to our last section, the rapid fire questions. I'm going to ask you 3 questions, short ones, and you can answer the first sentence which comes into your mind.
Okay.
What's one belief about ambition you've completely changed your mind about?
Well, that ambition is very often unresolved fear of not being enough, I would say.
What's one daily habit you rely on to stay grounded?
For me, that would be meditation, even if only 5 to 10 minutes a day.
What's one small experiment a listener could try this week to get a taste of lucid living?
Experiment, I would say, write down all the things you were worried about during 1 week, and then check the list a couple of weeks later, and you will realize that 9 out of the 10 worries that you had never happened.
And I don't want to crash your podcast, but I can just make a big +1 behind that.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Jonas. Now, I'm sure that there are people out there that want to learn more about your essays. They want to learn more about you and also your startup. So where do people find you and can learn more about you?
As you said, I'm building VARA. We are doing really pretty well right now. We have big ambitions still. And we write regularly about our progress on LinkedIn, but also on our website. So that would be vara.ai. And personally, as you say, I started to write much more. So share some of the perspectives that I have, try to make it intellectually resonant and raw and emotionally, let's say, relatable. And I do that on Substack. So you'll find me there. And my publication there is called A Founder's Search for Meaning. So that will be the keyword you'll find it with.
We will, of course, add everything to our newsletter that can be found on our website. So it's just to make sure that people find you. Thank you again for being on the show. I really appreciated the conversation, the also very personal conversation. And talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And now we would love to hear from you. How did you like it? What should we improve? Do you have any suggestions, ideas, or dream podcast guests? Please let us know.
Thank you, and see you again next week.